She will be talking about navigating conflict with compassion, the impact of empathetic rule enforcement at the Liliha Public Library. She's currently on special assignment to the Library Development Services section with the Hawaii State Public Library System. She holds master's degrees in archives and public history from New York University and library information science from Long Island University. Marissa brings a compassionate and empathetic leadership style to her work, aiming to foster inclusive and supportive environments for both her team and patrons. So her professional focus centers on enhancing information access, information literacy, education, and community engagement across library services. So please join me in welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Hawaii Library Association for giving me the opportunity to come and speak about the work that I did at the Liliha Public Library. When I interviewed to become the branch manager at the Liliha Public Library, I boldly claimed that I was willing and able to handle all of the problems that typically occur at this branch. However, it is one thing to state that in the calm of an interview. It is entirely something else to be standing there staring at a naked screaming person and realize,
Can you get a little closer?
Thank you, one more time, because you definitely interrupted my joke. It is one thing to state that in the calm of an interview. It is entirely something else to be standing in front of a naked screaming person and realize that this was the type of problem that you had just signed yourself up to handle. I started in this position of May of 2023, and I faced the daunting task of handling consistent rule breaking that often led to escalated and sometimes violent situations. In the beginning, when a patron broke a rule, I would go up to them and immediately state the policy and tell them they needed to stop what they were doing. If they didn't comply, I threatened the punishment of having to leave the library. I would often be met with arguments, frustration, and sometimes downright hostility. The moment I realized that I had to change how I enforced the rules was when I found myself nose to nose with a patron, with him raising his arms to shove me into a bookshelf. Thankfully, with some pointed language, he did back off. However, I realized that my authoritarian approach to enforcing the rules was part of the problem and not the solution to having clear boundaries around patron behavior. This escalated and almost violent patron interaction encouraged me to do research on rule enforcement, which has led to my strategy of empathetic rule enforcement. Empathetic rule enforcement focuses on building relationships and problem solving instead of punishment. The Liliha Public Library presents a productive case study for the effectiveness of empathetic rule enforcement because of the volume of incidents that regularly occur at this branch. While I'm no longer the branch manager, I am proud of the work that my staff and I did, because by changing the rule enforcement style at the Liliha Public Library, there have been fewer escalated incidents, which I define as a patron screaming, threatening, harassing, or becoming violent with a staff member or another patron, better relations with patrons, and improved staff morale. While this approach is by no means perfect, this method has made the Liliha Public Library a more welcoming community space for patrons where there are clear boundaries around acceptable behavior. Before I get too much further along in my presentation, I would like to define the two types of rule enforcement I will be discussing today. The first type of rule enforcement is authoritarian rule enforcement. When you use authoritarian rule enforcement, you gain compliance with the rule by threatening punishment. For example, if a patron was eating in the library, I would tell them they needed to stop eating because it's not allowed, and if they don't stop, they will have to leave the library. In my experience, when I utilize this type of rule enforcement, I'd be met with anger, screaming, curse words, and knocked over furniture. Utilizing fear of punishment as an enforcement tool is not very effective at best, and downright dangerous at worst. Empathetic rule enforcement is rooted in creating a connection between the enforcer and the rule breaker. When you utilize this method, you take the time to have a conversation with the rule breaker, creating a connection before you jump into discussing the rule they are breaking. While discussing rule breaking, you work with the patron to solve the problem. For example, if that same patron was eating in the library, I would have a conversation, inform them of the rule, and then work with them to find a solution on where they could go to eat. This method most often leads to compliance with the rules, even if it's begrudging, and a patron who is able to continue using the library. The goal here is still compliance with the rules, but you remove the threat of punishment from the interaction. I would like to be clear. Empathetic rule enforcement is not being a pushover. I defined clear boundaries around patron behavior to ensure that everyone could use the library safely and productively. I would deny patrons use of the library if they refuse to comply with library rules. However, I didn't use the denial of use as a threat. Instead, I used it as a consequence, which I'll explain later in my presentation. To understand the impact of empathetic rule enforcement on the Liliha Public Library, we can take a look at the tangible data from the Hawaii State Public Library System's incident tracker. Now, the following data that is above me is not every single incident report that I wrote. The data you are looking at are the reported incidents where patrons screamed at, harassed, threatened, or were violent with a staff member or another patron. As you can see from the data, when I took over the position, we had escalated incidents 4 to 6 times a month, except for the outlier of July of 2023. And because I took the lead on any major incident when I was at work, what this data shows is just about how many times these things happened to me. I had a very personal stake in reducing the number of escalated incidents at the Liliha Public Library. The incident with the patron who almost shoved me into a bookcase occurred in September of 2023, and I began to implement this new rule enforcement style in November of 2023. While there have been no significant changes in the Liliha community, there has been a steady trend downward of escalated incidents in the library since making these changes. If you average out the data from 2023, the average number of escalated incidents per month was 4. However, if you average the data from 2024, the average goes down to 1.75 escalated incidents per month. The data clearly shows that while the Liliha community has the potential to escalate situations with the correct rules management style, staff can reduce the chance of the situation escalating. When determining the effectiveness of this approach, I also considered staff feedback. I had multiple staff members report that they had better interaction with patrons when they used the tactics I will discuss today, that the library felt safer, and that they noticed that there were fewer escalated incidents in the library. From both a feelings and a data perspective, it has clearly been shown that empathetic enforcement of rules has had a positive impact on the Liliha Public Library. Now that I've shown you the data from Liliha, I'm going to explain how to implement this type of rule enforcement at your library. The first step of empathetic enforcement is building a relationship with patrons. The very first thing I did when I went up to a patron who I had never talked to, but who was breaking library's rules, was introduce myself. Hi, my name's Marissa, and I'm the branch manager at the library. What's your name? By doing this, you establish yourself as both a friendly person and as an authority figure in the building. I know it seems like a small thing to do, but I guarantee your interactions will go better if you take the 2 minutes to introduce yourself and ask their name. Exchanging names is how most people begin to build a relationship. So by doing this, you're taking a proactive step to build a relationship with a patron. And if the patron is willing and the situation allows, you can have a short conversation before you jump into discussing the rule breaking. This, again, is building a relationship with the patron while also giving the patron the opportunity to see you as a person instead of just a rule enforcer. While building a relationship is important, I've also done a lot of trial and error on methods for discussing rule breaking. I used 3 main tactics to diffuse and redirect rule breaking. The first thing I did was pass the buck. I threw my boss under the bus all the time. Sir, while I would love to let you keep clipping your toenails in the library, my boss would be pretty upset if I allowed you to do that. Would you mind waiting to do that until after you leave the library? That's a true story. By passing the buck, you aren't the bad guy. You're the poor employee who must enforce the rules. By throwing my boss under the bus for the system's rules, I got compliance without a fight. I will caveat this tactic by warning that you do not want to pass a buck to a person who is there with you in the building. It is much better to choose someone higher up within the organization whom the patron cannot get mad at in the moment. Otherwise, you risk escalating the situation instead of de-escalating it. Another way that I've been successful with gaining compliance with the rules is by assuming the patron doesn't know the rules. Tell a patron, maybe you didn't know this, but you can't eat your dinner in the library. Would you like me to recommend a place that you can go to eat? This works well because maybe the patron doesn't know the rules. Instead of enforcing the rules, you are informing the patron of the rules, which is a very distinct difference. Most people do not react well to being told what to do. By choosing to inform patrons of the rules, you're setting yourself up for a discussion instead of a confrontation. The third tactic I used was phrasing my request as a question. You may have noticed this already in this presentation. When I initially attempted to get compliance with the rules, I never used this statement. Start instead with, would you or could you? This will soften your words and give the patrons a chance to choose to follow the rules. All the tactics I mentioned work to de-escalate a situation before it can escalate, which is key to reducing the number of escalated incidents at the Liliha Public Library. But what happens when a patron wants to follow the rules, but they can't? For example, they do not have shoes. This is the time to break out your reference surface skills and not the threat of punishment. What resources does the library or the community have to solve this problem? You can also ask the patron for ideas on how they can solve the problem. This continues the theme of having a discussion with the patron and attempting to de-escalate a scenario before it escalates. You're continuing to build a relationship with the patron by trying to solve the problem together instead of tearing a rift between you by simply threatening the punishment of having to leave the library. If the patron still doesn't want to comply with the rules, then it's time to use choices. Set up the simple choice. They can keep doing what they're doing, but then they'll be asked to leave the library. Or they can stop what they are doing and still be able to use the library. By presenting the patron with a choice, they can decide if they want to follow the rules or accept the consequences for their actions. I will tell you now, this is not a fun conversation, but it is a productive way to outline the expected behavior in the building. By setting a clear behavior expectation and following through on the consequences, you are sending the clear message that there are repercussions for poor behavior and that you will act on them. After I began to see success with these tactics, I trained my staff with these methods. If you are a manager or work in a team, making sure that everyone in the building has the same way of enforcing the rules is essential. For example, if I enforce the rules empathetically, but my security guard uses an authoritarian rule enforcement style, then there will be issues in the building because those two forms of rule enforcement have different values. This is truly an all or nothing matter. Everyone must apply empathy or it loses its strength because the threat of punishment and the fear associated with punishment is so strong. You will not see success with this method until your team buys in. Before I close, I do want to touch on the limitations of empathetic enforcement because there are situations where it's no longer applicable. These are the situations where a patron cannot be reasoned with. They are violent or otherwise so escalated that de-escalation tactics no longer work. This is not the time to build relationships. This is not the time to problem solve. This is not the time to offer choices. This is a time to make sure that everyone stays safe and call the authorities if needed. In these moments, keep yourself and your staff safe. That will always be the most important thing. Problem solving and creating connections with patrons is difficult. It takes time and emotional energy. Some days I didn't feel like I had either, and I slipped back into an authoritarian approach. And every single time, I wished I hadn't. Taking the time and making the effort changes in interactions with patrons. I recognize that I am discussing and advocating for more emotional labor. However, I've also seen the firsthand benefits of that labor. I am proud of the work that I did as a branch manager at the Liliha Public Library because the statistics, staff feedback, and the closer connections with patrons made this work worth the effort. While I hope that none of you are placed in the situations I have been placed in, which forced me to seriously reconsider how I was enforcing the rules, I do hope that my wake-up call can be one for you as well. Because after all, wouldn't you want to be treated with kindness and empathy if you were the one who was breaking the rules? Thank you. Oh yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. I've also put my email up on the screen if you would like to continue the conversation at a later date. Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Whoop. As Jessica just said, in case you couldn't hear her, she just asked how I got buy-in from my staff. And I think the big thing was seeing success with me implementing the tactics. So showcasing, going up and talking to a patron beforehand, and then seeing situations that in the past had escalated, such as having to ask someone to leave for the day, and it would escalate quickly. Instead, being able to see those same patrons having a similar situation, and they didn't escalate, and so the patron could stay in the library. So I think taking the lead and leading from the front was a big way to be able to see the success. I also would train my staff in these methods through staff trainings. And what was interesting was that I would start to hear conversations in the break room. They're like, oh, I was talking with this patron and I did one of the tactics that Marissa mentioned, and we just had a conversation and they stopped breaking the rule. I just asked them, would you please stop? And instead of in the past, it would become a blow up, then it became just a normal conversation. And so it was one thing leading from the front, but also for the team to be able to practice these skills and then talk among themselves to be able to see the success for themselves.